Counselor Cabrales, Counselor Swanson,
Here.
Counselor Carney,
Here.
Counselor Schaub,
Here.
Counselor Cornwell,
Present.
Counselor Puente, Mayor Swenson.
Present. All right, we have 3 presentations to start our evening, and the first is our COVID-19 update.
One moment, let me get everything going. Good evening, City Council, Mayor Swenson. Hope everyone's doing well this evening. Our presentation up. All right, I believe everyone should be able to see that. So, yep, there we go. I just made a little bit. So, all right, do one more thing here. Okay. All right. So it has been a year. I'm going to do a little bit of a timeline here throughout the presentation. I asked Scott if I'd be able to kind of show some of the harder points in the pandemic. It's still hard. We're still losing people on a daily basis, obviously, which is so devastating. But I think just to show some perspective on how far we've came, kind of the points we've hit and things like that. I wanted to go through some things. We'll go through some different projects we've done throughout this process and several other things. So, and I'll try to go through it here in a timely manner since there's a pretty dense agenda. So this one is a little hard to see, and this is probably more to kind of view offline, but this is actually a timeline of events that the state of Oregon, the employment department put together. And so this is really goes from when the first COVID-19 emergency was shown and kind of goes through this whole timeline there. I have a list of events on the next slide that I'll actually go over. So March 8th, COVID-19 is actually declared an emergency by executive order. March 12th was that first, like, hey, we're not going to allow large gatherings anymore. So 250 or more weren't allowed. March 16th is when we really, that Friday before is when folks kind of went home, and March 16th is when we, as a city, were closed due to CDC guidance at that time. And so the stay at home, the stay home, stay lives order went into effect March 23rd. The Congress passes the CARES Act March 27th. You kind of continue through this process. June 1st, the library reopens to limited browsing. Please note that the library has a digital library that they've been providing the whole time during the pandemic, and also been providing technical support for that so folks could get registered and things during this time. July 20th, in July there, we actually opened up Woodburn City Hall for municipal court. We had it closed during this duration. And there was some definite catch up that needed to happen, as Tony would tell you, our finance director. And then in June 24th was the executive order that restrict in-person instruction for K-12 for the 2020 and 2021 school year. And then obviously we had the wildfires, then we had some pauses. We kind of went back and forth with the library. Then we had the first dose on December 16th. First COVID-19 vaccine dose was administered in Oregon. And then our first drive-through event at the Woodburn High School was February 9th, and then February 12th, that whole weekend with the historical ice storm event, obviously. So, and then February 26th, us as Marion County moved from high risk to extreme risk to high risk. So this is really what I wanted. You're getting into some of the data, and in the red here, you'll see the
City Council.
Excuse me? Oh, in the red here, you'll see a course of 5 weeks, which we hit record highs in cases, and this is for the 97071 zip code. So a little outside of our city limits, as we know, but to place it in perspective. So we had about 100. We had 126 cases in 1 week. We had 121, 157, 197, 188. And then these are the past few weeks here on top in black. So you see 13 cases, 24 cases, 27, and 8. So progress has been made. There was about 6 to 8 months where it felt like we were just pounding our head against a brick wall and not getting anywhere. And then we finally started to see some light and some progress. I also wanted to pull the worst 2 week span or 1 week, 1 week spans of the pandemic and compare it to where we were just a week or so ago. And during kind of the low points, right after Thanksgiving through the beginning of December there, you'll see that we had in Marion County 2,149 positive tests. That compares to 291 over the week of March 7th to the 13th. So it's an 86% drop, super exciting. And then you see also in the hospitalizations, we had 60 hospitalizations in that week compared to 12. Again, another 80% drop. And then you can see the similar in deaths. The state of Oregon's highest week in cases was also the same as Marion County's. So it did correlate. And you can see these large numbers here. So 14,475 during that wave compared to 3,406. So almost another 80% drop. Also across this time, so this data is actually pulled from the OHA outbreak report. So every week they come out with a report. Any cases that show up in a long-term care facility or associated with long-term care facility or a school shows up in this report, in addition to any businesses that have 5 or more cases is considered an outbreak. And so during this past year, we've seen 252 cases, 34 deaths in 6 different long-term care facilities in the Woodburn area, which is, 34 deaths is a really hard one to swallow. Businesses and schools, we saw 232 cases. Three schools/childcare facilities had cases. They each had 1 case, I believe. All of them only just had 1 case. And then 13 businesses in total kind of added up to those 232 cases. And again, businesses only really show up on the report if they had 5 or more cases. So there might be some business who had 1 or 2 or something like that, but they don't show up on the outbreak report until they hit 5.
Jesse, is that long-term care number, 252 cases, 34 deaths in 6 facilities, is that inclusive of this entire time of tracking, or I missed that piece?
Yeah, so this was from last week's report, which was released on Wednesday. So we'll have a new one this Wednesday. And at least from all the data I could pull, it gets a little muddled, but I believe this is as accurate as I could come for what they share at least. So.
Right, so they would have started accruing this data as of like looking back from the first documented case back in March of 19, or what does this number represent? What time
I believe
span?
That's when, I believe they backtracked it. I would have to double check in the full history of the report and check on when their first report was released. But this is my understanding is that this is during the whole duration of the pandemic. They started these outbreak reports really early on, especially with long-term care being such a high concern. And so, so my understanding, this is the complete from March of 2020 to today, or till last Wednesday.
Yeah, sorry, I said 19. I've been doing taxes, so my brain's in the wrong state. Okay, right. Cool. So basically, what I'm led to understand is long-term care. There have been 252 tracked cases of COVID-19, of which 34 resulted in deaths within 6 facilities over a 1-year time span. Does that sound accurate?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank
you. The thing to note with the cases is it doesn't necessarily mean someone who lived within the facility, but it could have been an employee who tested positive, or someone who's associated with the facility in some manner, is how they they tag a case onto a facility in that way. So
that's helpful.
Yeah. And then this is just more current data. So we are seeing continued trends. This is kind of backwards. So we go February 7th to the latest report here on the bottom, which is February 28th, the last 2-week cycle. We're seeing a drop in cases again, which is great. Hopefully that continues. We've seen a little bit of an uptick. I don't know what the next report's going to show. Might be a little higher, but we have 116.5 in the last 2-week span and a 3.4% positivity rate. And this is important because if we look down here below and we go to the metrics in which our risk levels are assessed, if we get 100 or below in this risk level category, as well as our test positivity is low, we'd be able to slide back into this moderate risk, which again would allow us opening, having some larger gatherings, different things like that. Restaurants would be able to have a little more capacity, and several other things would come alongside that. And Marion County is hoping that within the next few weeks we might see that trend, or the next month. It's just kind of hard to, we hope, and then you just need to wait it out a little bit. So I'm going to go over a few other things here just to talk about the things we've done over the past year. So the education and outreach, the PPE, the financial assistance that we've been able to assist with, and other community supports that we've done throughout this past year. So I pulled this number last week, and our outreach really went very heavy, really started toward the end of April, or middle to end of April. And in that year, almost it's been, or 11 months, we've seen about 1,152,975 kind of touch points, as I called them before in a previous meeting, just points in which people could have received information about COVID-19 or COVID-19 response. And again, this is a little, please note, like the radio is an estimate that the radio stations give us on their reach. So that is a little hard to track. But you can kind of see it. We had I'm very proud of this in the team, in how it kind of organically came together. You see social media and the website at about 29%. You see printed materials, and the mailers at 29%, and then you see the e-blast and radio. So there's just a very pretty even spread here, which I felt is good because you're hitting all kinds of ways in which people receive their information. So PPE, I've shared this number, and this is expanded a little bit. We've slowed down on this part because I think a lot of agencies have really kind of gotten it together. A fun note, we found out through Councilor Corrales that she went to the DMV and they were using saran wrap as their screens to block their employees from our residents. And she was able to connect with us and let us know, and we were able to get them some plexiglass screens, just ones that sit on the countertop. It was a little silly that we gave them to a state agency, but it was also, it's really the key message is protecting our residents and the people that use our things within our town. So we were happy to do it, and so we were able to give those plastic sneeze guard, a few of them, to them as well. That's 73,821 pieces of PPE to date. Again, I feel pretty good about this number because, we have a population of, in the last census in 2019, of just under 26,000. And this is significantly slowed down because people really have better access than they did at one time. All right, now I almost want to call this the Jamie Jump category. The COVID-19 funding. So you'll see there's on top, in the top section here, you see city funding. And so these were some funding sources that were directly allocated to the city, or grants received by the city, different things like that, our CARES funding, et cetera. So are the CBDG grants, the two different ones in there. The one CBDG for the rental assistance, and then this was not a CBDG, this was the rehabilitation grant that we transferred over as well. But that's at $2.1 million. For just those funds that we've been able to help reallocate and things like that. And then you'll see the nonprofits below here. And so we have the WDA funding through Woodburn Downtown Association, which we've been doing education and outreach through. The Love Inc. grant, which went to utility assistance. the Northwest Senior Disability Services through Aware Food Bank that was for food security for seniors in the Latinx communities or hard to reach communities. The equity grant that went toward utility assistance. This one I'm kind of excited about. We just found out how to meeting with the Salem Health Foundation and Centro, or Debbie Cabrales is in her capacity as the executive director with them, to provide a taxi reimbursement program. So as we know in the Woodburn community, we have a large number of folks that use our taxi system, and Salem Health was looking for a way in which to improve transportation access. And so we helped facilitate this conversation. And so Central will be providing vouchers to community members in which to give to the taxi companies. And then the taxi companies will take those vouchers and turn them back into Central for credit for a monthly or every 2-week check on that. And so that was $10,000, which is fantastic to get. That will allow folks to get better access to vaccines. Anything COVID related is what these funds can be used for. So we were really excited about that. We thought we were kind of innovative. You know, we have 8 to 11 different taxi companies at any one time in our city. So for being such a small town, it was just a really important need that we could help hit. And it's not always cheap. You know, it's $8 on average for an in-town one-way trip. And so if they can cover a full round trip to go and get access to a shot or access to whatever they need, this was just super exciting. Really great to make this relationship with the Salem Health Foundation. And then the big one that I'm probably gonna defer to Scott and Jamie and Allie on was the Mid Willamette Valley Houseless Alliance grant funding that just came through for $421,000. And I don't know if you guys will be talking about that more later or if you want to talk about it now. So.
Well, Jesse, it was on my list of stuff, but let's talk about it now because it's really exciting. And we just learned about this on Friday.
Yeah, go for it. I can close out on my slideshow if you want, or you can chat about it now. It's up to you.
No, go ahead.
All right.
Your program.
Okay. I was transitioning into the community funding side of this. So out of that $2.3 million that we have $2.3 million that we've been able to push back out into the community in some form or fashion. So PPE, childcare assistance, prescription, utility assistance, hygiene, houseless support now because of this new funding, business assistance, nonprofit assistance, food security, housing assistance and rental assistance and mortgage assistance, and transportation through our transit department. And then there's obviously with all of these, with these nonprofits, there is staff time involved in those. So you can see that breakdown here, but super proud of that number. So in the way of business assistance, we're currently in our 4th round of small business assistance grants. We've administered 64 businesses and nonprofit organizations to receive funding. $50,000 were originally funded from the general fund with the $10,000 match from Rotary. And then that was, again, doubled by the Business Oregon grant in which we received. In addition, we've put $90,000 of our CARES funding toward this effort. So a total of $210,000 that we've been able to funnel back out into the community in form of the business assistance program. And again, that 64 businesses is looking to expand because we're currently in our 4th round. We're kind of getting here toward the end. So other things we've done community education sessions for the sector guidance. That stuff was coming out fast and furious. So we were working on creating just education videos and things like that for our business owners in English and Spanish to be able to understand what was coming down the pipe, and it was coming out like a fire hose early on. Working with our faith-based communities on a regular basis, holding multiple calls with them and continuing to keep them in the loop. They're such an asset to our community and so connected to just all of the members within our community. Assisted businesses with outside grant programs. So yes, we help facilitate businesses to receive funding through us or funds that we did, but there were still other programs that we weren't facilitating that we wanted our business owners to get a hold of. And so Jamie and Amanda in ECDev, always great in just assisting our businesses through those processes. Vaccine access workshops, I talked about that before, where we kind of went through how to get folks signed up for a vaccine or how to at least find the information to do so. COVID-19 community updates, so continue to do those. The mayor and Scott probably see my face on more community meetings than they want to, but I'm at Rotary, I'm at Kiwanis, I'm at anywhere they'll actually listen to me and still give me airtime to talk about what's going on with COVID. So, and just give updates and help out folks. We also helped with sector guidance. I actually just had an email today with different, not just community businesses, but residents. I have emails from residents about what does this mean. I have emails from HOAs that were asking how it goes and didn't always have the answers, but we could facilitate people in the right direction. And then continuing to help out with the testing and vaccine events. The testing is slowed down, but we continue to support the vaccine events in the best way we can through Woodburn Ambulance. In what they're doing, we're actually going to be moving those events from the high school to Centennial Park for a few weeks and possibly out to the drag strip. That is kind of still under review, but we'll be having those vaccine events out at Centennial coming up in the month of April, starting in the month of April. And then created a organization group that I dubbed the North Marion County Vaccine Distribution Partnership, and that really involved our health leaders in our community and in Marion County to get everyone really on the same page when it came to vaccine distribution. That group still tells me they want to meet, so we'll continue to meet as long as they want to. And really just gives them an opportunity to convene and know what's going on with each other within North Marion County. So, and then one I didn't have on here, and I want to give Josh a shout out, they were able to get the shower program lifted off the ground fairly early in the pandemic with Ali and everyone else, Love Inc. and all those supports. But I think that's been a benefit during this time as other things are coming down the pipe to supersede what we're doing. But I think it was just a good little support that Josh was able to provide for sure. Moving into vaccinations. So more vaccinations are coming. We're a little slow this week, but going next week is when we're supposed to see an uptick significantly. Right now, we're getting about 125,000 doses a week in the state. We're expected to see around 200,000 doses a week. And so I just wanted to, these are just our weekly numbers and kind of where we're at. We'll probably go over the 1 million dose mark this week for the state. And then this Marion County, we've seen about almost 12% of our population has been fully vaccinated. With 19%, almost 20% who have received a dose. And this, again, the data is about a week old or so. Next is the vaccine phases. As everyone probably heard, there's more changes with that. So this is the vaccine timeline with some keynotes below. So Marion County actually was seeing kind of a slowdown within that 65 plus category. And so we were just kind of hitting, there were about 60%, 59% of the population was their estimate that they had vaccinated in Marion County, that 65 plus, but they weren't seeing the demand in which it saw early. And so they submitted a letter to OHA about entering phase 1B, group 6 early. And so as of today, that actually started. And what does that really mean? That means adults 45 to 64 with underlying health conditions, migrant and seasonal farm workers, seafood and agricultural workers, food processors, and people living in low-income senior housing and senior congregate living. And those affected by the wildfires, those experience houselessness are all eligible now. And then they're hoping that by April 19th, which is, I believe, 2 weeks faster than they thought, group 7 would open up, which is those with underlying health conditions 16 to 44, and then multi-generational household members. And then May 1st, as everyone knows, is kind of when everything opens up. So, all right.
Jesse, I'm going to jump in real quick because I always like to remind people now that when we closed our facilities about a year ago, City Hall, Library, Parks and Recs, Aquatic Center, that didn't represent the bulk of the city's employees. In fact, most of the city staff continue to work out in the field, continue to work in City Hall, our finance department, planning and building, public works, water, wastewater, streets, parks, the police department, code enforcement, The bulk of the city staff continued to work out in the field and did not work from home. Although those people who worked in City Hall, if they could work from home, often did and do. The other thing that I'd just like to point out is that a lot of this work that we've done that Jesse just highlighted was a result of us reorganizing Parks and Recs leadership and economic development to help focus and be active on COVID response and recovery. So that helped us, having leadership and strong managers in those programs helped us redirect towards this particular effort when Parks and Rec shut down. So good work to all those people. Thanks, Jesse.
Yeah, not a problem. Thank you, guys. Any questions?
I guess a question maybe for Scott. When we move into moderate risk, like what changes does that mean for City Hall's staff and opening City Hall when we're and then maybe with the library? I mean, what are some things we're going to be able to open up more when we move into moderate risk?
Well, I'll let Jesse chime in, but first I'm going to say that our goal is to open up as when we can. I think everybody really is excited at the prospects of restoring some level of access. And what does that mean? That will be really contingent on what the rules are coming down from OHA and from directions from the governor's office. So we kind of want to wait and see what that means when it comes to the types of services and programs that are available. It may be that things get phased in at different times. And then, of course, the other things have to be the financial recovery of the city and our ability to restore services just based on the dollars that we have. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Jesse, did that sound about right to you?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I was going to just nail down a little bit more to Mayor Swenson's question. It really isn't recommended until you get to low risk for businesses to open their offices to open. That's at least, and I can share that piece of information. I'll bring it back to council at the next meeting. But in moderate risk, they still recommend when able to work from home, just because we're not out of the woods yet, right? I do want to say those numbers are very encouraging, but we're not out of the woods yet. You hear rumblings of a fourth wave. There's a lot of things that could be happening. We're kind of in this race for vaccines and for them to happen, which is amazing. I can't, if you think about it, made me emotional pulling this presentation together, to be honest with you, because it was a long year and a hard year and challenging. And I'm just really proud of everyone, but we're just not quite out of the woods yet, but we're getting there and getting there fairly quickly, if you think about it in the way of things. So it's really going in the right direction fast. And so I think once we hit that low risk category, we'll green light unless something changes, and things change on a weekly basis. So yeah.
Jesse, it also, just two things real quick, Mr. Mayor. It seems that there's also been specific criteria handed out for government organizations as opposed to other types of organizations as well. And so we're waiting to see what happens with that. And then the other thing is, I just want to correct Jesse. He said he would bring this back at the next meeting, but I have begrudgingly given Jesse the next meeting off. So we're not going to see Jesse at the next meeting. Okay. Meeting after that.
Okay, any other questions from our counselors?
Thank you, everybody. And thank you to the team. You guys are amazing, everyone who's been around. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. Okay, next up is council briefing on the middle housing project.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. I'm Chris Kerr. With me is Colin Cortez. I thought I would just do a very quick introduction of the project before I introduce our consultant this evening. Of course, no formal actions required. The point of this is really to introduce the project, the consultant, go over some of the data that's being collected, the approaches being taken, and collect any feedback we can get from you at this point in time. As a lot of you know, this middle housing project, and that's what we're calling it, is necessary due to changes in the state law that happened after House Bill 2001 was passed, HB 2001. The purpose of 2001 was essentially to promote alternative housing opportunities, ideally more affordable housing in different areas within cities, such as in single-family districts. Essentially, cities have to apply the same standards to what we call middle housing. We'll talk about what that is in a minute. that we do to our single-family district. So in other words, the regulations we apply to single-family homes need to be the same ones that we apply to these middle housing types. Middle housing is, again, the consultant will talk about this in a moment, duplexes, triplexes, quads, townhomes, things other than single-family housing. Now, all this is going to mean pretty significant changes to probably our comprehensive plan and certainly to our development code, our zoning code. Now, to help facilitate this, we went out and requested a grant from the state to work on a couple different aspects of this project. We received those grants, and the consultants that we have working with us are working under those grants. I think it was $80,000 worth of grants. They're really, at this point in time, they're reviewing those deep technical analysis of what the requirements are under 2001, what the new rules and laws are, and how we need to work in it. So tonight I wanted to introduce, his name's Jamin Kimmel. He's with Cascadia Partners, and they're spearheading our consulting team that we have working on this project. They'll give more details, talk about who they are, and have some more details. I can turn it over to you now, Jamin.
All right, thanks, Chris. Hello, everyone. Glad to be with you here tonight. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I have a presentation to go through. And okay, can everyone see that? Great. So as Chris mentioned, I'm Jamin Kimmel. I'm a partner with Cascadia Partners, and we're a local planning and development firm. And we're partnered on this firm or on this project with a couple different firms, OTAC, Grayling Engineers, and Kittleson Associates. And so glad to be here. I'm going to walk you through a few things first today to give you a little background information. And then I'd like to pause a couple points in this presentation to ask some questions and to get some of your feedback on general direction that you'd like to see us head and how we draft code amendments that both comply with House Bill 2001, but that also are tailored to Woodburn's needs and the particular issues you see with how this bill will be implemented. So first, to give a little overview, I'll talk about what House Bill 2001 requires. I'll go over the three pieces of work that we've delivered to the city so far, which is a background report, a report on various code concepts, and then some infrastructure audit work. Here's the overall consultant team. I'm the project manager on the side of the project managing the code update portion. Sarah Breakstone, who wasn't able to be here tonight, but I'm covering for her, is from OTAC, and she's managing some of the infrastructure and engineering analysis. So this project kind of has two components to it in terms of implementation of House Bill 2001. And so the plan and code update is the part I'm running, and that will deal with drafting up adoption ready code and plan, comprehensive plan amendments to bring the city into compliance with HB 2001. And then there is a kind of a parallel project with that, which is an infrastructure analysis and what's a long acronym called IBTR, which I'll get into, which is a potential application to delay the adoption of code amendments to allow middle housing. I'll explain a little bit about that near the end of the presentation here. But we're working together in tandem, and at this point we're probably a little more than, or coming up on about halfway through our process. And I'll give you a little timeline here of what we've been working on so far. So we're here in March with our doing some meetings to the Planning Commission and the City Council. And we've been doing a lot of background work up until this point, and we are now beginning to get some of this information out into the public, at least virtually, and to try to solicit some feedback. And so we're here in that spirit tonight and looking for your direction as counselors. We will wrap up this project by the middle of June. And so it's on a fairly quick timeline. And following that, we will deliver a adoption-ready code amendments that the city can then, throughout the latter half of 2021, we'll go through the adoption hearing process to adopt the amendments. And the overall deadline for adopting code changes to comply with HB 2001 is in June of 2022. So we're a little ahead of schedule, but good because there's a lot of details involved in this. So that's the project overview. Now I'll give you a little bit of background on what House Bill 2001 requires. So first on kind of what is this idea of middle housing? You might have heard it also talked about as missing middle housing. And this is kind of a graphic that has been used quite often to try to explain this concept. But the general idea is that it's kind of a group of housing types that are a little more dense, so more dwelling units per acre, you might say, than single family housing, but can be designed to generally fit in with single family housing. And so at the same time, they also offer a different housing options to people and are typically smaller units, which can be more affordable to a wider range of households. So this is a big picture idea. And under Oregon's House Bill 2001, they've picked out 5 of these housing types, which are now must be allowed in all residential zones. And so specifically, the House Bill defines these 5 housing types. So a duplex, triplex, or quadplex, which is either 2, 3, or 4 units on one lot. So that's all the units on one lot, usually attached, which usually means they are a rental unit, but could be owned as a condo. Townhomes, which are attached units, but they're on individual lots. So the land underneath the units is divided, and they could be sold individually as a fee simple lot, just the same way as a single family detached house. And then there's this concept of a cottage cluster, which is something that's been gaining popularity, and it is basically smaller detached units that are oriented around a common courtyard. So each unit does not have frontage on a street, but it is oriented around this courtyard kind of internally. And because they're smaller units, you can really fit more in on your typical kind of infill lot or existing lot than you could your kind of standard size single family house. So all of these housing types are addressed in that new House Bill 2001 rules. There are various standards for each of those, which we'll start to discuss here. Also want to point out that there is some middle housing that already exists in Woodburn today. And this is just a couple of examples I pulled up from a quick search through Zillow and Craigslist. And so this is a quadplex on the left that was renovated in 2018, and then a corner duplex, which is built in 2005. So there are some examples of these developments and these housing types in some of your neighborhoods already today. The idea under House Bill 2001 is that they would be allowed more broadly than they are today. Oops. Sorry, I'm getting a little delay here. So what was the legislature intending under House Bill 2001? And I'm kind of learning to describe it in terms of 3 big picture goals. The first one is having options. So allowing for housing types that allow for smaller units in more locations. And so because the units are attached, it's more economical to make them smaller. There's a need for smaller units with household sizes, average household sizes going down, demographic changes. So allowing that type of housing unit in more places is important in terms of just having enough options to meet the various needs of different communities. And supply. So there's also an impetus here to try to open up more opportunities for housing development. There's an overall housing shortage across the state, and especially in some of the larger cities. And so that was one of the other goals, was to just create more housing units. And then there's also a goal here about kind of diversity and equity. So what that's getting at is allowing a mix of housing types in every neighborhood can make the neighborhood more inclusive and diverse from a number of perspectives, but mostly from an income perspective, from a race and ethnicity perspective. And so having a mix of housing types, some that might be more affordable and some that are accessible to a wider range of people, will result in less kind of segregation of neighborhoods by income or race. So that's another one of the driving kind of motivations behind the bill. And so there's two basic tracks for complying with House Bill 2001 for cities. And I should mention that Woodburn is classified as a large city under the House Bill 2001 rules, which is any city over 25,000 in population. So you're just above that threshold. And so there are many cities right now across the state all dealing with the same issue and trying to figure out how they're going to comply with the rules. The rules are quite complex, and they are very specific and prescriptive. There are not many ways to get around the basic premise that middle housing should be allowed in most places where single family housing is allowed. But there are two basic tracks for how you comply. And the first one is kind of what we say track one, or the default, is to meet some specific benchmarks that the state has set for a set of design and development standards. So if your code meets the benchmarks that the state has set, then the Department of Land Conservation and Development, who will administer this program, will approve it, and approval is fairly straightforward. This is the approach we're recommending on behalf of the consultant and staff because it is more likely to be approved. It is less complex to administer. And we think that meeting those benchmarks is something that the city can do while still tailoring these allowances and the code to respond to specific issues in Woodburn. The alternative track becomes quite a bit more complicated, and there are a few different analyses that the city would need to submit to the Department of Land Conservation and Development to demonstrate that the proposed code is consistent with the intent of HB 2001. Those are things like demonstrating that middle housing is allowed on the majority of the lots where it applies to, and there are specific numeric thresholds for how many lots for each housing type must be allowed on. And then there is a slightly more subjective determination about whether the standards that are put in place or proposed by the city would cause unreasonable cost and delay to the development of middle housing. And so this is a subjective determination. The city would submit something that details out the construction costs and the land costs and availability of land to weigh the public benefits of the proposed regulation against the cost. And at the end, the city would need to then provide an analysis that puts all of those factors together and states to the state that these costs are not going to prevent or have unreasonable cost and delay on the development of middle housing. So for that reason, approval is much more uncertain and requires some detailed analysis, and particularly a real estate finance or economic analysis. And so under that track, it is much more difficult to get approved. Still possible, but it is a little bit more tricky. So with that in mind, we're recommending the track one approach, just simpler for the city. But we will keep in mind that there are these backup options should these proposed code changes not be acceptable. Okay, I'm going to go into first, I'm going to go through a few more slides and then I'll take a break and pause for some questions and discussion. But I want to highlight some of the findings of our background report, which went through and applied these new state requirements to the City of Woodburn's Comprehensive Plan and Development Code. And we audited each of the code for compliance with the standards and want to point out some of the key changes that will need to be made. So the first thing to cover is that House Bill 2001 does apply to all of the city's residential zones. So it applies to any residential zone where single family housing is allowed. There are a few kind of minor carve outs where middle housing can be limited. It can be limited somewhat in areas that have environmental resources that are important, so wetlands and stream corridors, things like that. And there are in places that have already been master planned, so in a planned unit development and a large planned unit development, which Woodburn has a few, there are also some carve outs for that, where the rules apply somewhat differently. But generally, all of the city's residential zones will need to be updated. And the most significant changes would be to the single family zones, which are RS and R1S. And so that is the light yellow and the orange in this map. The areas in brown are the medium density residential. And in those areas, there are less significant changes because they are already planned for or kind of intended for higher density residential multifamily apartments. But in the RS and R1 zone, the current code limits duplexes to corner lots, and it does not allow any of the other middle housing types, which must now be allowed. And so that's going to be the significant change to these zones is in at least some areas, or I should say most areas in the RS and R1S zones, duplexes must be allowed on every lot where a single family is allowed. That's an important distinction between the other housing types where those need to be allowed in most areas in residential zones. So that's where that issue of needing to demonstrate that the majority of land in those zones would be available for one of those housing types. So those are one of the most significant changes going to take place. An important piece of context about that is that the likelihood that middle housing is actually going to be developed is actually limited by some existing covenants, conditions, and restrictions, so CC&Rs, that will likely prevent middle housing development. And these are private CC&Rs that are part of a usually a homeowners association in a subdivision, and these are the subdivisions that the city knows have CC&Rs. We don't know whether they prevent middle housing or anything other than single family housing. From my work, I often find that those CC&Rs, if it's a single family subdivision, do prevent that. But that is one factor that will limit the impact of these code changes, is that though the code changes, the zoning changes, the CC&Rs are still enforceable, and they could in effect prevent middle housing unless the homeowners association was to amend those requirements. But important note is that new CC&Rs, so any new covenants, conditions, or restrictions may not prohibit middle housing. And so anything that's been adopted after I believe in anything 2020 or later cannot prohibit middle housing, would not be enforceable. And one more factor that will impact how middle housing developed, of course, is the market. And in Woodburn, we see there is still quite a bit of vacant land zoned for these middle housing types and generally zoned for apartments and multifamily housing. And so we don't see a major influx of middle housing happening in existing single family neighborhoods or on developed lots, redevelopment and demolitions occurring. In most places that have already adopted these types of allowances in single family neighborhoods, they happen incrementally over time. Redevelopment or infill is always more complicated for developers. They prefer to build on a vacant lot. And the demand for a single family detached house continues to be strong. And some of these middle housing types may not be as attractive to build for some developers. So we don't know how their market respond in general, but there's reason to think that there won't be a huge wave of development occurring as a result of these code changes. So HB 2009 also sets some specific caps on the minimum lot size that can be required for middle housing. And the intent behind this is to make sure that most lots are kind of eligible to build middle housing, and that cities aren't requiring more land area than is really necessary, kind of increasing the cost of development. So there'll be some pretty significant changes that need to be made to the city's current minimum lot size requirements. This table kind of details that out. For example, a duplex right now is required to have an 8,000 square foot lot. Well, in many zones, a single family house is only required to have a 6,000 square foot lot. And so that will need to be amended so that a duplex can be built on the same size lot as a single family house. There's just similar changes will be needed for things like townhouses and some of these other small multi-unit triplexes and quadplexes buildings, where those would now be classified as multifamily housing. And in the future version of the Woodburn Code, those will be kind of classified separately and regulated separately than multifamily housing. City must also reduce the amount of parking, off-street parking, that is required for middle housing types. So currently today, the city requires 2 spaces per unit and does require garages. Only requires garages for half of the units in a multifamily building, but still requires them. And under House Bill 2001, the city can't require generally any more than 1 space per unit for middle housing. And garages cannot be required for most middle housing types. So that's also going to be a significant change from the existing parking policy. Okay, I want to break there for some discussion, open up to a few questions. I have a few more slides to go through after this. Things we wanted to understand from you. Do you have any questions about the purpose and scope of the project? Do you concur with our recommendation to pursue the track 1 approval, so the simpler approval? And just generally, do you have any other initial concerns about the project you want to make sure we're aware of?
Scott, go ahead. I see your hand up.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Well, Jamin, I don't know how much I like track 1, to be honest about it. I've got real concerns about House Bill 2001's impact to our community. And I'm not going to go into the politics behind how this came to our town and why we're taking this aspirin, but Woodburn is a unique community, and I believe that this bill creates a long-term threat to our historically significant cultural neighborhoods. And we see the gentrification occurring up in Portland that's being driven by pretty poor land use decisions over time, just like this. And I'd hate to see part of our lower income neighborhoods detrimentally impacted by this bill over time as development opportunities, pop up that create for that kind of gentrification effect. I liked your graphic. It had the crane tearing down the house because I could see that happening in parts of Woodburn. So I have real concerns about that. The other concern I have is the cost impact to our neighborhoods around consuming infrastructure that was designed, built, and planned on approved state plans for single family housing that now it's supposed to somehow accommodate greater usage, and the cost impact to our already economically impacted community. Woodburn is not a rich town. It can just dig up and replace lines on whims or pass those costs off onto middle housing developers and think that that's still going to be affordable housing. So the problem is that, you know, generally this law is a one size fit bill that doesn't take into impact, you know, communities that are diverse, really diverse, and economically impacted. You know, and the, you know, what's happening in Portland should stay in Portland, in my opinion. I'd hate to see it have to come to Woodburn as a way to try to solve some problem. And the other thing I would just say, and I know there's nothing we can do about this, and I'll stop my rant, but if there's no opportunity for cities to provide available land to accommodate market need, they will not solve the housing crisis in Oregon. You know, that it's incomplete. So if the market can't provide enough, if there's no land available to meet the market demand for affordable housing, the cost of housing will continue to be high no matter what it is that you build. And I think that's been historically demonstrated for the last 100 years in the state. So I know we have to comply with this law, but I think that whatever we can do to try to protect the economically vulnerable parts of our community, where people don't live on the golf course with an HOA, who apparently aren't impacted by this law, we need to try to do that so it is equitably applied across our community. Because the way the law is written now, only people who are vulnerable are going to be impacted by this in a detrimental manner. And I just think that's wrong. And to our ability to protect our neighborhoods, we should be able to do that. My rant is over, Mr. Mayor. I apologize. I'm done.
Well, Mr. Kimmel, would you like to respond to any of that, or do you want to hold on for some other questions from the council and then respond all at once?
Maybe just to one piece of it, as I think it is a really important point, and we should, within the confines of what the city is allowed to do under HB 2001, we should explore how we can do this best. And I think if I could define the problem that you're stating well enough, is that the lower income areas in Woodburn are likely to see more redevelopment or new development, which would displace people that live there currently. And I think it could either displace them by physical redevelopment of a site, or just by rising prices because the area is more attractive to build in. So the displacement is definitely not the intent of House Bill 2001. And if the city was to propose an alternative approach to that didn't meet the strict kind of track one standards, but the goal was to reduce displacement, I think the state would look at that favorably. And as long as the city can make a strong case for why that needs to happen, then I think that's definitely a possibility. So we'll take a closer look at solutions to how to do that. I think you might be able to do that even within the track one approach. But I just want to say I heard the concern.
Other councilors would like have questions for Mr. Kimmel? Councilor Carney?
Mr. Kimmel, I've got two questions. My first one is, you didn't specifically say so, but I imagine that all of this is restricted to new construction.
Not entirely. So there are some rules that the state has passed that would allow for the conversion of a single family house to a middle housing type. So for example, if someone was to take their house and convert it into a duplex or a triplex, they would be allowed to do that. And there's actually, the rules tend to actually encourage that versus kind of redevelopment. There are no, if by new construction, these rules do not necessarily require any existing homes to be redeveloped or anything. It requires the city to update their code to allow it. Does that answer your question?
No, what it does is it poses a second question for me. And just to add on to what you said, I'll pose an example. If a single family home was to burn down within the city of Woodburn to the ground, and then someone was to rebuild on the site and put in cottage clusters, we know from experience that, number one, that single family home had a specific system development charge applied to it when it was built. Now, when the new cottage clusters are going to go on the site, it's going to by necessity include more people than would have normally been on that single family lot. So I imagine there are no restrictions for us as a city to redesign our system development charge for that location, charge more to be able to account for improvements in our infrastructure, and so doing keep everybody even.
Yes, generally that's true. The rules don't set any new restrictions on how cities can set their system development charges, which are typically set on a by unit basis. So a site that's being redeveloped from 1 unit to 5, 6, or 4, or however many units would then, yes, be required to pay more in system development charges, and probably 5 times more, or however many units more. So these rules, yes, don't limit system development charges. I'm not sure about that situation of if it's a house that's been burnt to the ground and rebuilt, likely that you would still have to pay system development charges per unit.
Okay, so just to get back to the basics though, nothing in your examination of this bill indicates that we would not be permitted to be able to equalize those charges. Like there's no retrospective, you can't do it.
No, no, not at all. And this, I think, brings up a point I wanted to mention, is that in terms of the infrastructure impacts of middle housing, which we'll talk a little bit more about related to the IBTR request, but more broadly, if the city finds that a middle housing project is cannot be supported by its existing infrastructure, it can require the developer to provide the infrastructure to serve that site. Now, if the developer cannot provide it, then the city has a recourse to deny the development. So this is in keeping with, as a city would do today with a residential subdivision. If the developer cannot provide the necessary public facilities to support it, or the improvements, then they will, the application can be denied. So that does not change under middle housing.
Okay, all right, just 2 observations. The first is that where the challenge is really going to be is significantly down the line. The sewage plant, the water plant, things like that, not the local piping. The second thing is, the dynamics of capitalism. What's going to happen here is a couple of astute developers are going to sweep in, and they're going to gut 1 or 2 blocks of Woodburn's low-income neighborhoods, and they're going to put up market-based condominiums before you know it. So, if anybody thinks that that's not in the future, they're just not thinking. That's just a comment on my part. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Cartney. Other questions for Mr. Kimmel? Okay, that.
I have one, Mayor.
Okay, go ahead.
So, and maybe I'm misunderstanding this whole thing, but just in case I'm not. So I'll do what Councilor Carney did, give an example. So in essence, as a city, now when we enter into a relationship with a builder who wants to, say, for instance, build a multi-unit housing development, we have certain powers to be able to reach agreements on how many parking spaces and how many did I understand that those that authority that we previously had and make it all kind of like any future builds of multi-dwelling units?
You were kind of breaking up there, but I think I got
Was that a clear question?
most of it. it was just the audio was breaking up, but I think I got you. Give it a try. So yes, if a developer was to come propose in the future, they more development would be allowed by right. That is the intent of House Bill 2001. And that may make it less likely that a developer, for example, uses a planned unit development, where the city would then enter more into kind of a negotiation with the developer over certain aspects of it. So that is the goal, or part of the intent of House Bill 2001. It does limit the types of housing that can be built. So it does not allow for all multi-family housing, and so it's specifically those.
I did catch that.
Housing types,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So, but it definitely
I know
does
exactly.
remove some of the authority. Okay.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
All right, other questions before Mr. Kimmel continues? I'm seeing no other green.
Mr. Mayor, could I follow up with a question that Councilor Swanson asked, just to make sure I understand too?
Sure.
So if somebody wanted to build middle housing right now on existing residentially developed or zoned property, they would have a right to increase the density on that particular property, and we'd be restricted by law from requiring additional parking on that site under the existing zoning rules.
Do you mean existing? So today, like the city's code right now, or when the
Require a garage and 2 parking spots. But right now, under this law, on that same piece of property, after this law was passed, we can no longer require a garage or 2 parking spots if it's a middle housing project on existing residentially zoned property.
Well, in terms of the timing, right now, the law hasn't taken effect yet.
But you get the gist of my question, though. We have property that's zoned residential that's now available for middle housing. People have a right to increase the density beyond what it was zoned for, and the city is in a less of a position to require garages and parking for that site in that neighborhood.
Yes, that's generally true.
Okay.
Although the law doesn't take effect until next year.
I understand. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Scott.
All righty, anyone else? Okay, seeing no green microphones. Mr. Kimmel, please continue.
Okay. So now I wanted to cover a little more details on some of the code concepts that we're putting out. So these are kind of conceptual options for the city for how to implement HB 2001. And so we'll walk through a few of them and have a pause at the end to gather your thoughts on some of this. So the first one is on minimum lot sizes. And so the House Bill 2001, under the kind of track 1 approval, the city can require larger lots for a middle housing type than for a single family house. But like I mentioned, there is a cap on the size of lot that can be required. So essentially here as an example, the city could either, under one concept, require, for say, a 7,000 square foot lot for a quadplex, where in most of the city's residential zones, a 6,000 square foot lot is required for a single family house. Another alternative, which is perfectly acceptable under the law, is that the city could allow a quadplex on the same size lot as a single family house. And a reason that the city or that the state is limiting the lot size that can be required is that attempt to not have unnecessarily high lot sizes, which will result in higher land costs, and they tend not to actually have as big of an impact on making sure the middle housing is compatible with single family. So here's an example of where you have a duplex on the same size lot as a single family house. And so it's twice the density, yet the thing that makes this duplex compatible with the single family house is much more about the design and the size of the building than it is about the size of the lot. And so for that reason, the big idea here behind the state is to focus more on the form and design of the building and a little bit less on how much land it sits on. If the city was to require somewhat larger lots for middle housing, it does have an impact on where middle housing can be built. So if it's the city's goal to limit middle housing generally, then requiring a larger lot size, minimum lot size would do that. So under this example, the light blue areas are where a quadplex would be allowed if the minimum lot size was 7,000 square feet. If you were to reduce that to 6,000 square feet, then those lots in dark blue are the additional lots where then it would also be allowed to build a quadplex. And that's 1,200 lots. So that does make a pretty big difference in terms of where middle housing is kind of eligible to be built. So another issue is, focusing more on the building itself, is that we're proposing that the city kind of take a look at some different approaches to how it regulates the height and size of buildings. So this is an example on the left of if the city was to just apply its existing standards to, for example, a quadplex that's built out at the maximum allowed under the zoning. That's kind of what the building could look like. And if the city, though, was to apply some new limits on the bulk and size of middle housing, and there's different ways to do this, but the idea would be, the existing standards around lot coverage and setbacks and height would be tweaked. You could achieve a form that's more kind of in keeping with the size and the scale and the kind of shape of your existing single family housing. So there are ways to do this that are perfectly okay under the rules, so long as those same limits are also placed on single family housing. So this is one way the city can try to ensure the new housing as it's developed is more compatible in terms of its visually and its bulk and scale. So another key issue I want to talk about is design standards. And there's basically two options for how the city could approach this. The one is so the city currently has two sets of standards. It has a single family and duplex architectural standards, and then it has multifamily architectural design standards. And one thing the city could do is modify those single family / duplex standards to also apply to middle housing. So the same kind of design standards would apply to whether it's a house or it's a row of 4 townhouses. And those would cover things like the exterior materials, the pitch of the roof, some details about the facade and how the entrance is located and how big the garage is. So all those things could be applied to middle housing, and that is likely to result in more compatible designs of middle housing. Now, an alternative to that would be the city can keep its single family or duplex standards as they're written today. And for all middle housing types, they could apply a model code that the Department of Land Conservation and Development has put together for middle housing. And that model code, however, is more permissive of middle housing than your existing single family and duplex standards. It regulates a lot of the same things, but not all of the same things. So some things it does not regulate are siding materials, roof pitch, garages, it's a little more permissive on. So that's a key standard. I'd be interested to get your kind of big picture thoughts on which of those you think is more appropriate for Woodburn. And with that too, is if we are modifying the design standards, then there are some opportunities to tweak those to improve your architecture landscaping standards for all housing. So this would apply to single family and middle housing. And those are things like front yard landscaping. Right now, there's no requirement to have a certain amount of landscaping in front yards, and that can really help middle housing to fit in, especially in neighborhoods that are kind of more mature, have a lot of mature landscaping. New housing tendally fits in better if it has a little more landscaping in the front yard. There are other things. The thing the city could do would be to require rear or side access on corner lots. So this would help to have the garages face out to the rear of the lot rather than the front, and kind of have a more attractive facade of the building. If there's less garages, more porches in front main entrances. There's also an opportunity to improve the design standards that apply to garages to make them kind of less prominent. So you can require them to be recessed behind the facade, or you can require them to have certain design elements or multiple materials. Those are things can kind of make a big difference in terms of the look and feel of a new development that has a lot of garages. There's also might be an opportunity to have a little more flexibility in the current design standards. So they are fairly prescriptive about a few items such as roof pitches and materials. And there are plenty of examples of what could be considered pretty nice looking developments that would not comply with your current single family and duplex design standards. And so those 4 images there on the right are some we collected that are a little bit different style than what is kind of intended under the standards, but might be acceptable in Woodburn. And so interested in your feedback on, should a little bit more flexibility be allowed, with still the idea that there's a certain level of quality in the design that is required by the standards. Lastly, one thing we noticed is that the regulations and design standards are not tailored very much to the different neighborhood character and patterns that are found across Woodburn. So here's just a quick example to compare a couple of lots and houses in downtown to a ranch house in West Woodburn. And obviously the size of the houses, the height of the houses, the architecture, the many things about these are different. And so right now though, those 2 houses would be in the same residential zone, and they would be subject to the same set of design standards. So we're interested to hear from you is there, would there be support for design and development standards that are more tailored to kind of what we termed as neighborhood pattern areas? You could also think about as neighborhood character areas. And we did an analysis to try to identify and kind of group areas based on they have very similar characteristics. And we can use this to kind of regulate middle housing development a little differently based on where it's located, and to try to achieve more compatibility between, if you get a new row of townhomes that comes in next to a single family house, you might want to have a different set of standards if that happens in the downtown Woodburn area versus in West Woodburn. And so if there's support for that idea, we could move forward in that direction. So a few questions to pose to you, and feel free to answer any of these, whichever is important to you. And so we touched on, should larger lots be required, even if that means it has some impact on the amount of development that is possible? Should there be additional restrictions on the size and bulk of middle housing, even if that's also applied to single family housing? Should design standards be elevated? So some of those features that I called out that could be required that aren't today. Or would you prefer design standards to be more limited? And then should those regulations be tailored to different neighborhoods more than they are today? Any thoughts or questions on the code concepts?
Well, this is a lot of, it's not a fire hose. You're doing a very good job of delineating everything, but there's a lot of points to go through. Councilor Carney, Councilor Cornwell, Councilor Swanson, Councilor Shubb?
I have no comment.
Who's on?
Go, you're on now. You're
Go,
you
Sharon.
spoke up. Go ahead, Sharon.
Okay, thank you. First of all, Mr. Kimmel, I'm absolutely frustrated at the whole concept of this House bill. I know you had nothing to do with it, but I agree with every statement that Scott Derrickson made. I'm concerned about less parking, and to even think about larger lot sizes and restriction as far as size and bulk, and even design standards. I just, there's so much information I just can't quite comprehend and make any decisions. And even after going through the huge packet that we had, but my question actually is, if we're talking about track 1 or track 2, okay, you made a statement that there's a possibility of us making some changes in track 1, and I just want to make sure I understand the complete differences in track 1 and track 2, and how that will affect all of the discussion questions that I have in front of me right now. And I know you can't answer all of it, but I just wanted to give you my feedback. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, the rules are complex, and so you're not alone in trying to kind of grasp what this all means. Many cities are doing that right now, and it's a lot to take in terms of what this means in terms of how development will be regulated in Woodburn in the future. The track 1 and 2 are not formal definitions in the rules. It's just my way of kind of categorizing these things.
Okay.
But basically what it means, let's take, for example, the minimum lot size issue. So let's say if the city wanted to have a minimum lot size for middle housing that's higher than that 7,000 square foot cap that I discussed, the city could do that so long as they could then show that the middle housing is allowed on, so for a specific example, I believe quadplexes would be have to be allowed on 70% of the residential lots in the city. So that in effect would cap the minimum lot size you could set, because you can't exclude too many lots that are existing. So that is the alternative track 2, but there are a lot of different flavors of track 2, depending on how many variations you want to propose from the track 1 minimum compliance standards. So there's a few options, but the basic difference is the approval by DLCD is less certain, and the city will have to make sure to conduct that more detailed analysis in a way that can be approved by DLCD.
Mr. Mayor, Jamie, can I ask you a question procedurally? Is the planning commission going to look at these recommendations and then work its way back to the city council?
Yes, yeah, and actually I think we're headed to them next week. We already presented some background information to them.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the question, but one of the things I might recommend is that just as a general principle, whatever provides the greatest span of control to our local citizen decision-making bodies like the Planning Commission and the City Council, and protects our neighborhood from the detrimental impacts of this bill as we see it, probably is a good approach to go. And then to work out some of these details in the Planning Commission, who will then make their recommendation to the City Council. So it kind of feels like cart and horse here because of the Planning Commission's involvement. Is that helpful?
Yep, that is, yeah. And we expect to be able to report back with the Planning Commission's feedback after the next meeting. I think the timing just happened to be that we were here first, so we wanted to see if you had clear thoughts on it, and completely understand if there's a lot of information to take in and don't have a clear direction for us today.
Well, you can tell we do have a lot of thoughts, so.
Well, thank you, and I agree with that statement from Mr. Derrickson.
Okay, any other questions at this point for Mr. Kimmel?
Can you understand what I'm saying, Mayor?
Yep, Councilor Swanson, go ahead.
Okay, so my feedback on this is, it goes back to the original concern, and I don't know that it's a lack of control. It's more any facade requirements that we would ask for, or any bump up, would be costs that we would forward to the builder or the developer. So if the idea, I mean, I understand this is all about land use, environmental land use, but really it comes down to affordable housing, that if we restricted it enough, it's no longer affordable housing. So I guess that's just, maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but it seems to me that the more sanctions we set around the building, the more the costs will be passed along to the consumer. And yes, we can accrue our costs as a city based on how many people are flushing their toilet. But at the end of the day, it just negatively affects lower income neighborhoods.
Yeah, I would just agree with that in principle, that the design standards can elevate the cost of development. And so that is a trade-off that should be weighed with each design requirement and any, I think, regulation of housing that put in place. I tend to think there are ways to regulate design and development that preserve the option to build lower cost construction types. And so there are ways to set design standards so that they don't automatically increase the cost of housing. But a key question is, where are these housing types allowed? And that's another factor in affecting how much development you can expect. And that's primarily a function of the lot size that's applied, and whether the city chooses to kind of exclude certain areas through minimum lot requirements.
Yes, I think the overall concern you're hearing, and I'm trying to summarize, is that if you take neighborhoods that that are populated with mostly rental homes, and because now you can build duplexes or fourplexes, the owners of those homes choose to sell them, and do that, they're able to make more rent from that. Would that displace the people that are in the single family homes at the moment, right? And so maybe what are the broad strokes from this legislation about those concerns, and what are the city's remedies for that one?
Yeah, the legislation doesn't have a lot of direction there. I mean, one of the assumptions under this law, I believe, is that more housing is good regardless of kind of where it's located, which on a statewide basis, that may be true. But on a local basis, that can have impacts on particular communities if development is concentrated in certain areas. So the legislation doesn't have a lot of restrictions that are based on trying to prevent redevelopment and displacement. But should the city, enact some restrictions with that goal, so long as they're well justified, I think for the most part, those could be approved under the rules.
Mr. Derrickson?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. One question. One of the things I think is important is that this isn't necessarily affordable housing we're talking about. It's market-driven housing, and the market will set the price. And so potentially some of these benefits to developers will just make these more profitable, not particularly less affordable, is a concern that I think a lot of communities expressed, particularly when this law was being drafted. And in fact, is exactly what has happened in Portland, where we see that the cost of housing has not come down, and that displacement and gentrification continues to displace lower income people for these higher density developments in particularly vulnerable neighborhoods. So, I think the idea that, more housing will drive prices down, but it's not necessarily the case because it's not a uniform across the state. So hopefully, the benefit would be if it was affordable, but there's nothing in this bill whatsoever that says that this housing must be or will be affordable at all. It'll be market driven.
Yeah, I think a scenario for that is we have in neighborhoods that are predominantly have rentals. That's where not just one large family would live, but you would have two families or sometimes three in those areas that would not fit into an apartment and are not able to purchase a home even amongst the 2 or 3 families there. And so,
but we'll be asked to pay similar rent for a smaller unit where they can't support as many people who would normally be living there.
Exactly, right. Okay.
Yeah, I agree with what Scott said too, because I think my upset as a city councilor here is our goal is affordable housing, and I see this as completely contradictory.
Yeah, in our situation. Okay, anything else from Mr. Kimmel?
But we do have one more section here to get through.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, the long acronym, infrastructure-based time extension. So as I mentioned, there's 2 parts to this project. We just got through the plan and code update. This part is about the infrastructure audits that have been done, and the city had requested that in part of their grant to evaluate the possibility of requesting an extension on adopting any new middle housing allowances until infrastructure issues in a particular area could be resolved or improved upon. And so OTAC and Kittleson Engineering and Grayling Engineers took a look at this possibility, and there's a whole set of rules, separate set of rules on what cities must do to apply for this extension request and what types of extensions are eligible. And actually the team that our consulting team was part of the team that helped to write those rules, so they're pretty well familiar with them. Just a little bit of background. So they do have some fairly strict parameters about what could be considered an infrastructure deficiency, and then is therefore eligible to extend the timeline before you allow middle housing. And so it must be an existing deficiency or something that's anticipated to occur before December of 2023. You cannot assume so the rules limit how much middle housing development you assume in any particular area. It specifies what are eligible deficiencies for each type of infrastructure. And it also says that citywide deficiencies are not eligible for an IPTA request. So this must be a particular area of town where you, as a city, are saying our infrastructure is deficient there, and allowing middle housing will make that problem worse, and therefore we'd like to not allow middle housing yet until we can fix that issue. So we took a close look at various transportation or various infrastructure types. And so just presenting some of the findings of that audit. And in terms of transportation, basically the city would need to either show that the roadway doesn't meet a current mobility standard and would be impacted by middle housing, or there are roadways that have inadequate emergency access today. And neither of those thresholds could be found, or there is not enough evidence and information to be able to make the case to the state that those issues exist in Woodburn in terms of transportation. For water or sewer, the threshold for being eligible for an IBTR is that there's a severe deficiency which results in unacceptable service levels that would be made worse by middle housing. And based on the city's current capital improvement plan for water and the wastewater facility plans, the planned capital improvements would generally accommodate the middle housing additional demand that is caused by middle housing. And so those thresholds also weren't found that could be met in terms of submitting an IBTR. And there's a similar set of findings for stormwater. And we found that there's not a major issue with a lack of stormwater in infrastructure in existing developed neighborhoods. And the downstream conveyance systems do not have enough of a severe deficiency to be able to justify an IBTR request as well. So in general, the audits found that there is not enough information and data to be able to support a IBTR application, which means that we don't recommend moving forward in the process and the next steps of that scope of work for that part of the project, which the next steps were to actually begin to prepare the IBTR application. So the recommendation from consultants and staff tonight is to forgo the IBTR application route. And what that means is that then the city will then comply with House Bill 2001 on the general timeline that is required by the state, which is by June of next year. So that's the recommendation. Just curious, wanting to know if you have any questions about those analysis, and you concur with that recommendation to not pursue the application.
Mr. Kimball, could you go back to the
just a quick question, if I might. You mentioned that
ahead,
the infrastructure impacted areas weren't based on citywide capacity, but neighborhood capacity. But then we look at citywide master plans that look at citywide capacity to make a determination about middle housing. Why wouldn't we look at likely areas of middle housing and the infrastructure that exists in that immediate system as opposed to the facility plans? Did I misunderstand that?
Well, I think if there was, I think if you were able to show that a citywide facility was going to be negatively impacted by middle housing, then that could potentially qualify you to exempt or to request an extension. I think the distinction is that the city cannot request an extension for all areas of the city. It would have to be for a certain area, but they did look at all citywide facilities as part of this audit.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Kimball, could you go back to you had 3 slides with this one, the previous one before that?
This one, stormwater?
No, the one right before that one. Okay.
Is this it? Water and sewer? No?
Yeah, so I guess this is the, I'm wondering how this relates to a concern that I've heard before, is that if enough fourplexes go up as a, that are replacing, single, family housing, like, will that add to the pressure on our water sewer systems? And does this relate to that one?
I think the distinction is that could occur and may be likely to occur, that there will be additional costs on your infrastructure system, and there might be capacity issues that could be attributed to new middle housing development. But under the question we're asking here is whether or not the city should attempt to delay implementation of middle housing until those issues can be fixed. And under the state rules, we're just not finding that the city can make that case, that they need to delay implementation of middle housing. So it doesn't mean that a deficiency or an issue doesn't exist. It just doesn't mean it meets the threshold for delaying implementation.
Gotcha. I mean, I guess I'm trying to understand current capacity is being met, but like in some of the scenarios we're talking about, if in neighborhood A now there's 10 fourplexes or 20 instead of those housing, like, do we have is current capacity being met's not the question, is do we have the capacity for more sewage and water lines?
Yeah, and they looked at that as part of the audit. Part of the reason it probably doesn't show a major issue is that the rules do limit how much new middle housing you can assume is developed. So it's 1% incremental growth for infill development and 3% in greenfield areas. So what that's saying is it's not assuming that every lot that would otherwise be a single family house is now a quadplex.
Right.
So there's kind of a cap on the growth assumptions that you can include in this calculation of your capacity.
But to clarify, those are assumptions, and if a developer got on it, it's not a limit, right? We can't take an area and say only 1% will be converted into middle housing. That's just an assumption that that's the way it would go, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah, if it's more than that, then it would just be up to whether or not the city can require that developer to make the improvements necessary to fix the infrastructure issue.
Okay, so that's kind of a big outstanding question. And okay, other questions or comments for? Well, Mr. Kimmel, I'm sure you get this a lot, but I'm going to just say your first name fast, and then when I tell people that I spent more than an hour with Jimmy Kimmel, right? So,
there you go.
sorry, I'm sure that comes at you all the times.
It's okay.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and look forward to coming back to you.
And really appreciate the questions and concerns. That's much appreciated, your patience and your explanation.
Thank you, Mr. Kimmel.
All righty, then we're going to move on to the third presentation, interestingly enough, building activity in Woodburn.
Good evening, City Council and Mayor Swenson. At this time, I'm going to ask Heather to help me out and share a report that you folks see every month. It's a building activity report. And Councilor Carney, if you would do me a favor and keep track of time, I've been told I got 10 minutes to answer your building questions and anything that's related to these reports. And I tend to keep that so.
Okay, Ted, you're at 8:48. Go
Thank
for
you.
it. And by the way, I want to compliment you on your new look.
Oh, this?
Yeah.
This is actually an old look for me. The other look was a new look for many years.
You look like a college professor.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, I think that's a compliment, right, Mayor?
That's a compliment, yeah.
Okay.
It'll be a trend here, the goatee and the mustache.
Right. So, counselors, you've seen this memorandum in the packet for many years after years. And the format is a historic format. And I have 30 years worth of information based on that format. And if anyone had any questions about what this represents, I'd be happy to answer it right now. It's not a complete representation, but it is the same format that we have historic history for 30 years. So it's helpful to kind of keep the format the same. Basically, you're looking at the last 3 years worth of permits that were issued for the month of, in this case, February. And it gives you at the bottom a fiscal year-to-date rolling number. Is there any questions that I can answer?
Ted, what does that number mean?
The fiscal number? Yeah, that's a dollar value based on how much money people are actually spending in our community. That's probably the best way to put it. So that's the dollar value that the permits and the development equal for that particular month, and the rolling average for the fiscal year in a 3-year comparison. And like I said, it's similar to 30 years worth of information that we have. What this report does not show are additional fees and permits collected for mechanical, which is both commercial and residential, and fire life safety items. So it's kind of a gross number. Heather, if we can change the page. Thank you. The next 13 sheets in this particular report are a report out of the e-permitting system that's a little more detailed, and it does include those other numbers. And it'll tell you what the fire suppression is. You can see that there was one permit issued for the month of February and the dollar amount. And if you go on and scroll through, you can see there were 3 commercial permits. And if you flip through, you can see that there were, 3 commercial mechanical permits and 2 commercial structural permits. And then we get to our dwellings, right? Our 1 and 2 family dwellings. That's our new single family dwellings. And if we can flip all the way down to, I think it's page 7, you'll see a total down there that in the month of February, there were 23 new single family dwellings. And then of course, the corresponding dollar value that represents. And that's basically what this report is afterwards, the 13 pages. It's a more detailed report that we can get out of e-permitting. And I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Does anyone have any other general questions about building or building under COVID or numbers or anything that I could answer? Trying to keep in the time frame.
No, seeing none. Go ahead, Ted.
Well, that was the crux of what I had to go over, was just if you folks had any questions on the reports that you were getting. I can share some numbers, what's happened in the building department while we've been under the COVID restrictions, if you'd like.
Please.
So numbers, we've heard a lot about numbers, and Scott, I want to thank you for putting me on right after the middle housing. That's one of my favorite subjects, as I gather many people's.
You know how I feel about it.
Yeah. Jesse did a very good job in threw a bunch of numbers at you folks. I wanted to share a quick story. I bowl as a hobby, and I've coached bowling. And on my bowling team, I have 2 business owners. We started bowling last week, and they were talking about COVID relief for small business, and that the state had passed legislation providing $45 million statewide for small business and COVID relief in terms of what it costs to pay for leases, et cetera. So there's a number, and we've been throwing around a lot of numbers, and now I'm going to tell you some others. So from March 10th, 2020, which is about the time that we kind of closed down City Hall to the public, but like Scott had mentioned earlier, many of us stayed in and worked. Through today, I pulled a report, and we've issued 782 permits during that time. One of the things we did to be more efficient with COVID is that we increased our dollar value as to what could be paid online. So it limited the folks needing to come into the building to pay and pick up their permits. We went from a $1,500 limit that was self-limiting to $25,000, which would include a typical single-family home. So they can do all that online, pay for the permit, and those are trips that our cashiers don't see. So we issued, again, 782. The dollar value for that period of time, 47, excuse me, a little dyslexic here. 74 million.
3 minutes.
524,000.
3 minutes.
Thank you. $74,524,809 worth of dollar value. So inside the city limits of Woodburn, we issued by far more what the state has given for COVID relief for small business in terms of that leased property. During that same time, we've done 2,200 or 2,249 inspections. So your city staff, and I'm not talking about the building department, but your city staff overall has been very busy.
Mr. Mayor, there's another thing, if I could just interrupt Ted for a moment. Something that the city council probably doesn't know yet, but this is actually Ted's last week with the city before he retires, which he intends to do on Friday. And I want to take just a moment, Ted, to just thank you for everything you've done for the city. You know, Ted really picked up the baton from where our last building official had it and moved the city forward into the modern age with online e-permitting. Ted also continued to build on relationships in the building community to having one of the best and I think smoothest running building programs that I've been part of in my career. Ted's done an outstanding work for the city, Ted. I'm sure gonna miss having you around, but I wanted to you've earned your retirement for sure. And I'm so happy that you're about to have your next phase, but I wanted just to say thank you in front of the city council and the community for everything you've done. And you know how I feel about you. You've heard me say that. But I do wish you the absolute very best in your next phase.
Thank you. That's very kind of you to say so.
Good luck, Ted.
Thank you. I think I'll just leave the last couple numbers with you. And I got a number since December, the first part of December to today. We've issued 97 new single-family dwellings. And under those COVID times that we put parameters on, it's been a total of 155. If anyone would like to ask any questions, I'd be happy to give it my best shot at answering anything.
I have a quick question. How does that compare to the same timestamp last year?
Well, because I have information based on fiscal years, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I can share with you that for the fiscal year of 2019 to 2020, we issued 55 new single-family homes. For the fiscal year prior to that, 18 to 19, we issued 32. The fiscal year prior to that was 2017 to 2018, we issued 32. And the year before I actually came to the city, we issued a total of 2.
I remember that. Times were very difficult.
Historically, the largest number of single-family homes that were issued were back in 1999 to the year 2000, that fiscal year, and it was 210. And basically, what you're seeing is Smith Creek opening up and the available lots and builders coming in and pulling permits and building, as well as finishing up Boone's Landing, that subdivision.
Thank you.
Yes.
Councilor Schaub?
Thank you. Ted, I just want to say that since I've been on council, I really appreciated your permit issued report that you do all the time. I love to see it because I can see all of the different addresses of the applicants for, whatever they're doing, whether they're putting in a air conditioner or a gas furnace or whatever. I really appreciate that. And I also want to say congratulations on your retirement, and I wish you the very best.
Well, thank you, Councilor Schwab. I'm glad you find the information useful. And I'll ensure folks, I'll be able to pass on the baton. So if you want to see that information, hopefully they'll continue providing it.
All right. Was a person who's retired and then got too busy, Ted, like, don't run for mayor wherever you live. Okay.
I don't think there's a large chance of that.
Okay.
Thank you.
However, you would be a most excellent mayor wherever.
I appreciate the compliment.
All righty. Any other questions for Ted? All righty. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for your time.
Okay. We're going to move to the consent agenda. And so ask our city recorder to read the very lengthy consent agenda.
The item on the consent agenda is as follows. The Woodburn City Council meeting minutes of March 8th, 2021.
Does anyone want to pull this item and talk about it? Or if not, I'll entertain a motion to pass.
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Seconded.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Okay, so now we're going to enter into a public hearing for supplemental budget request for acceptance of grant awards for the Community Development Block, CDBG, and CARES Act Emergency Rental Assistance grant funds, and the Appropriation Authority for expending the grant revenue for their approval purposes. So I open this hearing. We have a staff report, please.
Tony, I can't hear you. I see that you seem to be unmiked on the screen, but I still can't hear you. I don't know if anybody else can or not.
No.
I hear nothing.
No.
Check your keyboard, Tony.
When I was having trouble with my microphone, I had to log off and log back on, and it would work.
Yeah, Tony, we're unable to hear what you're
Just give me
saying.
a thumbs up, Tony, if you want me to talk about it. Okay. So, Mr. Mayor and City Council, this is a supplemental grant that's on the order of business directly after this hearing that allows the city to budget for the grant award of $450,000 that we received through a community development block grant program to provide rental assistance. And so the council approved this grant application, and we've been on quite a roll lately for getting grants. And now that this grant's been awarded to the city, we need to provide the budget authority to actually spend the money for its intended purpose.
Okay, any questions about that? I know we've talked about this before.
No questions.
Okay, seeing none, I'll ask if there's any testimony by proponents. Any testimony by opponents? I'll close the public hearing. Any further council discussion? Okay, then we'll be addressing this in our next portion of the meeting. All right, we'll move to general business. The next item is Council Bill 3144.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to introduce Council Bill number 3144.
Council Bill 3144 has been duly introduced, and being an ordinance requires 2 readings. May we please have the first reading by title only if there's no objection?
Council Bill number 3144, an ordinance granting a cable television franchise to Comcast of Oregon 1 Incorporated and declaring an emergency.
We've had our first reading of Council Bill 3144, and we have our second reading again by title only if there's no objection.
Council Bill number 3144, an ordinance granting a cable television franchise to Comcast of Oregon 1 Incorporated and declaring an emergency.
All right, is there a staff report?
Yes, there is. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, City Council. This is Mackenzie Grant. I'm your Assistant City Attorney. I'm also joined this evening by Jim Rao, the Assistant City Administrator, and the city's consultant on this matter, Reba Crocker. With us as well are 2 representatives from Comcast, Tim Goodman, who was here at your previous meeting, as well as Kirk Nord. As introduced at the previous meeting through a presentation, in the spring of 2020, Comcast approached the city to discuss expanding its services to the Woodburn community. At that time, the city contracted with the consultant Reba Crocker to negotiate on behalf of the city towards a franchise agreement. That is what's being presented to you this evening. The franchise agreement's about 50 pages. So within your staff report, staff pulled out some of the key components of that agreement. But of course, we're here and prepared to answer any of your questions this evening, but I'll go through kind of some of the main points and then again, open it up to questions from the council. And if there's any additional information that Comcast would like to provide this evening, there'll be some time for that as well. So this is a cable television franchise agreement. This would allow Comcast to enter the city market and utilize the city's right-of-way to provide that service. The term of the franchise, this initial agreement would be valid for 5 years following the effective date of April 1st, 2021, pending your approval this evening. Of course, that would include the option for the parties to mutually agree to renewal of the franchise at a later date, as long as everything's going well. But we thought that initial 5-year term was important since this would be a new service and new to the market in Woodburn. The franchise fee that's associated with this agreement is 5% of gross revenues, and that is specifically defined within the agreement itself, but that's the maximum percentage that's allowed under federal and state law, and would be the same percentage currently imposed under other competitive franchises for cable services. We talked a little bit about some of the construction-related provisions and future annexation implications during the previous presentation. But essentially, Comcast would be responsible for obtaining all necessary permits, providing the city with a construction schedule for all work within the right-of-way. And we'd be looking at a build-out over probably the next 6 to 18 months. As areas of the city, as future areas are annexed into the city, Comcast would provide the same or similar services to those residents, and there's specific provisions for that. And of course, again, as we discussed, anywhere where the utilities are currently undergrounded or where the city would permanently move utilities underground, Comcast would also underground their facilities. Just so you're aware, while Comcast is, building out the system and providing services within the city, all of their trucks, all their workers would be clearly identified as Comcast workers, including their contractors or subcontractors. There are specific provisions within the agreement that cover things like customer service and where a Comcast store, the most closest Comcast store would be located, that would take physical payments for services down the line, how rates and service charges are set into the future for customers. And then one final thing that I did want to mention, as part of the during the period of negotiation for this franchise, the city of Woodburn's PEG access channel WACAT did shut down their public access and government access channel. But that doesn't mean that this agreement doesn't consider the implications if that channel were to come back at a later time. So while the city is no longer operating a PEG channel, the agreement does have kind of a reactivation provision in it if WACAT were to begin that channel in the future, or if another, if an educational channel came through the Woodburn School District, or another government channel came online. And then the fees associated with that are included in the agreement, but again, kind of track with other competitive franchises in Woodburn. So with that, I do want to ask Mr. Goodman if there's anything that Comcast, any information Comcast would like to provide this evening. Otherwise, I'll open it up to the City Council.
Yeah, thanks, Mackenzie. Again, Councilor Swenson and members of the City Council, City staff, and public, this is Tim Goodman. I'm the Senior Director of Government and Regulatory Affairs for Comcast and work out of our region headquarters at our Tigard office. And just a couple of things I would like to cover. At the 2 weeks ago when I presented, there was an ask about the construction date and how long that would take, the timeline for that. So I went back and I gave you an estimate. Well, I was kind of right, but was kind of wrong too. So we anticipate once that construction begins, we would be able to start offering service about 6 months later from that date versus a year or later. So basically, as the system builds out, we will be able to provide service to customers accordingly as we go through the respective neighborhoods. So that was that's an update that I would wanted you to know. Additionally, Comcast is ready to expedite this project, meaning normally takes about a month to get signatures back on our end on these franchises. We're trying to get it back in 2 weeks. We're going to be processing our performance bond and our insurance certificates within the next week. And those are things that typically don't come for several weeks down the road or even months, but we're getting all of that in place. And also so we can begin submitting our permit applications for work in the city's right of way.
So in the press release, like are you doing one, and what would be, like, what weeks are you talking about beginning here and in your expedited time?
Are you talking about what part of the city we are starting at first, Mayor?
Right. Yeah. Just to kind of let people know, like, when and where.
Yeah. What we're hearing is we will probably start, because of where our fiber will be coming in from the city, is somewhere on the northeast side of the city. We'll come in from there, is what we're hearing. We can confirm that for sure. but that's where the fiber is. Our main fiber will be coming through, and so we would anticipate that neighborhood or those neighborhoods and businesses being impacted first. But we can get back to you with some type of confirmation, because that is what we've been told, that I want to see something. I asked for something more concrete today. I haven't received it yet, so we could give you guys a better idea of where we're at. There was a question by Councilor Carney at the last meeting around our marketing, and I have a little more information on that as well. We'll be doing direct mail, door hangers, radio marketing, television marketing, social media marketing. We'll be doing local sponsorships and sponsoring events and so on for signups. Some of the multi-dwelling units will be doing some lunch and learn programs about our services that we'll offer, and we'll work with the property managers at those. Our community investment team will be putting on strategic events and sponsorships within the city, and it's gonna be full scale. It's gonna be a really big marketing campaign. We're gonna hit all different types of areas and media.
And again, a timeline for when you'll be doing that, like that'll begin in the month of?
We will probably begin that, and depends on when we get our permits. So, we expect to have a signed agreement back to y'all within a couple of weeks.
Okay.
The effective date of the franchise would be April 1st. So we can't really do anything before then. We will automatically begin applying for, as soon as we get a signed agreement back to the city, we'll begin working with your city departments who are involved as far as getting our permits for the right-of-way work, and pushing on those. And then as soon as we get those, I would imagine we will start our marketing efforts in the city.
Wow, that is exciting.
Mr. Mayor, I have a marketing follow-up question.
Go ahead, Councilor Swanson.
So as far as a general marketing blitz, it's fair to say that will not be selective, but I'm assuming you won't be hanging door hangers in neighborhoods that don't have the availability to connect right away. Would that be a fair assumption?
That would be a fair assumption. We would start with the ones that are going to have access available. There may be some, that may go out citywide that this is coming, but those that are going to be what the service would be available first would get more of a blitzkrieg type of a media effort and marketing effort.
All right, other questions for Mr. Goodman? All right. Excellent. Okay. Any other discussion before we're doing a roll call vote?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Last call.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to make a motion that we enact the ordinance granting a franchise to Comcast of Oregon, Inc., Comcast, allowing them to construct, operate, maintain, and provide wireline cable television services within the city of Woodburn.
Second it.
Mr. Mayor, a point of order. We don't need a motion for an ordinance. We just, it's already been read by title, so we just need a roll call vote.
Okay.
Roll call.
We'll move to the roll call vote.
Counselor Swanson,
In favor.
Counselor Schaub, Counselor Schaub,
Yes.
Counselor Cornwell,
Yes.
Counselor Carney,
Yes.
All right. The motion has duly passed.
Thank you, everybody, for your time. And I'd especially like to thank Reba Crocker was our lead negotiator in getting this franchise to you this evening. So I really appreciate and want to express my gratitude for her work on this. I know she's been in front of you guys a few times in the past couple meetings, and without her, this would have been a pretty big lift for staff. So we really do appreciate her time this evening and her work in negotiating the franchise on behalf of the city.
I think on behalf of the city, I can say that this has been an issue that has been brought to the individual councilors, to our city administrator, to the mayor. People have been looking for options and looking for improvement of services for a long time. And so this came as a pleasant surprise. I mean, it was faster than we thought. And so again, I want to thank Reba and Tim for that. I can speak for a lot of people in the city. I think you had us at Comcast, right? So you made great presentations, and we're obviously convinced by our vote, but we really appreciate your coming to our community.
Yeah, on behalf of Comcast, I truly appreciate the cooperation with city staff on this. And I also would like to say that Comcast is looking forward to the future with City of Woodburn and becoming a true partner as we bring in our products and services, but not just that, but what we do in the community as well through our community investment initiatives that will benefit, those demographics of folks who maybe need a little more help in certain areas, and we have some great programs to help with them.
I know that.
Could I add also that this franchise moved along really fast, and that has a lot to do with Comcast as well, and the fact that they were really willing to meet the unique needs of your community, especially with the current franchises that Wader talked about. So it really was a very collaborative approach, and it worked really quickly, and I'm really happy with the turnout. So I wanted to thank Comcast for that as well.
All right, without quoting Humphrey Bogart, but I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. So thank you, guys. All right, next we're going to go to Council Bill 3145.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to introduce Council Bill number 3145.
Okay, Council Bill 3145 has been duly introduced, and being an ordinance requires 2 readings. May we please have the first reading by title only if there's no objection.
Council Bill number 3145, an ordinance annexing approximately 73.08 acres of territory known as the Weiss family properties into the city of Woodburn.
We've had our first reading of Council Bill 3145. May we now have a second reading again by title only if there's no objection.
Council Bill number 3145, an ordinance annexing approximately 73.08 acres of territory known as the Weiss family properties into the city of Woodburn.
All right, a staff report, please.
Evening again, Mr. Mayor. Chris Curry, Community Development Director. I didn't really have much of a report. I'm sure you'll recall this is an annexation and a rezoning of property, and there's no specific development proposed with it at this time. That would come at a later time when they had a specific user for these sites. About 100 acres in total. I'm sorry, it's 75 acres in total, 24 on the west side of I-5, 50 on the east side. The zoning that's called for is consistent with the comprehensive plan designation. And it's in our SWARE property. But I'm happy to answer any questions if you had.
Questions for Mr. Kerr? Okay, do you have any discussion? All right, hearing none. We will also have a roll call vote.
Councilor Carney?
Yes.
Councilor Cornwell?
Yes.
Councilor Schaub?
Yes.
Councilor Swanson?
Yes.
All right, Council Bill 3145 has been duly passed, and thank you, Mr. Kerr, and your department for all your work on that. Next, Council Bill 3146.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to introduce Council Bill 3146.
Council Bill 3146 has been duly introduced, and being an ordinance requires 2 readings. May we please have the first by title only if there's no objection?
Council Bill number 3146, an ordinance designating zoning to approximately 73.08 acres of annexed territory known as the White's family properties as Southwest Industrial Reserve zoning district.
At our first reading of Council Bill 3146, may we now have our second reading again by title only if there's no objection?
Council Bill number 3146, an ordinance designating zoning to approximately 73.08 acres of annexed territory known as the Weiss Family Properties as Southwest Industrial Reserve zoning district.
Okay, Mr. Kerr, anything to add to your previous comments?
I did not, but I'm happy to answer any questions if you had.
All right, I'm seeing no questions. Any other discussion? Then we'll move to a roll call vote.
Counselor Schaub?
Yes.
Counselor Carney?
Yes.
Counselor Swanson?
Affirmative.
Counselor Cornwell?
Yes.
All right, Council Bill 3146 has been duly passed. We will now move on to Council Bill 3147.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to introduce Council Bill number 3147.
Council Bill 3147 has been duly introduced and is a resolution, and as such requires 1 reading, and may we please have the reading by title only if there's no objection.
Council Bill number 3147, a resolution approving transfers of fiscal year 2020-2021 appropriations and approving a supplemental budget.
All right, is there a staff report?
Mr. Mayor, this is the implementing resolution associated with the hearing we conducted a few moments ago around amending our budget to allocate the $450,000 community development block grant received by the city.
Okay, any other discussion about this? Hearing and seeing none. We will entertain a motion.
Roll call vote?
Is it a roll call vote too?
Yes, please.
All right, so roll call vote again.
Counselor Cornwell?
Yes.
Counselor Schaub?
Yes.
Counselor Carney?
Yes.
Counselor Swanson?
Yes.
All right, Council Bill 3147 has been duly passed. Okay, item E, City Council support of Senate Bill 784. And I believe our city administrator will give us a presentation about this.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Over the weekend, PGE reached out to me and asked if Woodburn would be willing to endorse and support Senate Bill 784. I reached out to the mayor and council president first thing this morning to see if they were amenable to amending the agenda to add this particular request. And then it was amended, and a little staff report was added today that sort of outlines some of the objectives of this particular Senate bill. I'm not super familiar with it beyond what was the information that was provided to me and I passed along to the city council. Typically, the city doesn't take legislative positions as a city without city council support. And so this is something that PG would like the city council to consider. I think there's a few other cities that have endorsed this particular legislation, and they would like to have Woodburn on their list of communities that are in favor of it.
I had a chance to review the bills, and the essence of what I read in it was that there are cities around the state that are trying to compel other cities to join in and develop a very early and rigid protocol to accept various forms of energy such as wind power, solar power, that sort of thing. And what this bill does is it returns the autonomy for making those decisions to individual cities rather than having a cabal or a cartel of cities determine what all cities must do in the state of Oregon. So I support this bill for the reason that we cherish our independence in choosing our energy sources, and I think we should continue to do that going forward.
Of course, Councilor Carney had read the bill more thoroughly than I did, but I support the bill because I called Wendy Valise 10 times a day during the ice storm, and I know that PG is very conscientious about creating opportunities for power that's earth friendly, that's sustainable, and so I think that their take on this and then their direct ask for us to do that is merited. So, anything else? Any questions from the other councilors?
Well, I have one comment. This is the polar opposite. The reason I support this bill is because we spent the greater part of this council session hearing about something that pertains to Portland that now as a state we're all facing. And so I think this is a pretty great illustration of why we want to retain autonomy in our decision-making abilities at every turn. So I completely support it.
Other comments or questions? I do want to take this moment that our in the meetings I'm in with other mayors and other regional meetings with different cities. There are other cities have lobbyists that like follow these things pretty closely, and so I just want to compliment our own city administrator and our staff that follow the what's happening in the legislature and are able to articulate what's good for cities. And of course, the Oregon League of Cities is an organization that performs that same task, and so I just want to thank you, Scott, for kind of being on top of these kind of things and able to give our city council the opportunity to weigh in on bills that are coming up. Okay, this requires a motion and a second.
Mr. Mayor, I make a motion that we adopt the I make a motion that we adopt. Is this a resolution?
No, you can simply make a motion that the city council endorse this particular bill, Senate Bill 784, unless the city attorney is going to correct me here.
No, that's correct.
Thank you, Scott. Mr. Mayor, I make a motion that the city support this bill number 784 as described earlier.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Okay, we'll next move into our city administrator's report. But I also want to take the pulse of the council because it's 9:30, and we also have a work session to follow this. And just asking people if that's something before we enter our final stage, if we want to continue that work session, or if we want to have that at our next meeting. So maybe I can.
Let me be the first to say I would rather wait until our next meeting.
Okay. Other opinions?
There's two people gone this meeting anyway.
Okay.
So those are two people that have asked for work sessions as a group, so yeah.
Okay.
So it would require a bit of retraining.
Okay.
Right.
That sounds like the majority of the Pulse wants to not go for another hour tonight. All right. Okay, then let's move to our city administrator's report.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Probably one of the most significant things that's happened this past week that I wanted to tell the city council about is the allocation of the Congressional CARES Act funding to the city of Woodburn. We learned late last week that the cities over the course of 2 fiscal years, starting in the next 30 days, will receive $5.36 million from the federal government to mitigate COVID-related impacts, both to the city and for the community. So the city is currently working on a proposed financial plan to come to the city council on how to allocate those dollars to reimburse the city's programs and how to allocate those dollars in the community in a way that can help mitigate COVID impacts to date. And I'll tell you, this has changed the city's financial outlook substantially from the week prior to last week. And we've committed to come to the city council with a plan that will make investments in this community with those dollars over the upcoming years so that they can provide returns for years to come. And so we've got a team that's working on that, and we're going to bring that plan to the city council for the current fiscal year, and then try to build that into the proposed budget for the upcoming fiscal year as part of that process too. But it is a substantial sum of money for the city of Woodburn, and I think it is beyond anything that we anticipated back when this legislation was being considered in Congress. And along these lines, our team met today. We have meetings set up with FEMA this week to talk about recovery of our costs associated with the ice disaster. And we're working hard on that. The council may know that we've estimated the general fund impacts of that to be $700,000 with an overall impact to our city budgets of $1.1 million. So any federal FEMA reimbursements could be very significant to our community. And so we're working hard on that this week as well. A couple things. We already talked about some of the grant awards we received for Ray of Hope and for the shelter program. Good job to our team that works on that. We're getting quite proficient at bringing in these dollars for our community. Very significant. And then I wanted to tell you that I've been contacted by PGE, and I'm working to draft a paper that will be published in the National League of Cities newsletter called The Art of Engagement, that will talk about our partnership with PGE and the city's success and lessons learned from engaging the most diverse city in the state of Oregon. And so I'm pretty excited about that. We've already worked through a draft, and as soon as it's ready to go, I'll be sure and share a copy of that with the city council. And I also want to let the city council know that I've also been asked to testify in the legislature about the impacts of COVID to the city as an organization and the community, and talk with some legislators about lessons learned in Woodburn and how we effectively found ways to engage and outreach and still provide, and in some cases, enhanced levels of services through the crisis. And so I've agreed to do that. I think that committee's date keeps bouncing around, but I'll let the city council know when that happens as well. So that's what I have, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Okay, Councilor reports. Councilor Schaub, do you have something to do?
I just would like to say, I just think Scott and our staff has done an excellent job during these crises, starting back in 2020. And I also want to give a shout out to Woodburn Ambulance. I think they've done a terrific job in assisting our community with the COVID vaccinations. And I'm just so proud of this city. And Scott, a job well done.
All right.
Bravo.
Councilor Cornwell.
Yes, I've had some constituents concerned about a sign that's being posted in a window of a private property, and it's free speech. I'm well aware of that, but the sign is very offensive. It uses a swear word talking about our president, current president, and it's right by a school. It's heavily trafficked by vehicles, And it's just offensive, and it's really, Scott just said art of engagement. We're trying to encourage people around us to see how great Woodburn is, and Sharon saying how proud she is, but it just takes one person to put up a really nasty sign that really discourages me as well as my neighbors. And because it's free speech, we've gone through the process of trying to get it, people talked to and removed, but we're just told there's nothing we can do about it. It's like graffiti. If there are swear words of graffiti up on public property, it's removed immediately, as well as it can be removed immediately. But this is something that we can't touch because it's a private home. And every day we drive by and it's telling F Biden. And it's just, you know, even if it said something somebody I didn't support, I still would not want it up there for my children to see, or people coming through town. It's just so good, and I don't know what to do about it, but they wanted me to bring it up here, and there you have it.
Mr. Derrickson.
Councilor Cornwell, you're right about free speech and the city's inability to deal with signings like that. But one of the things I might recommend that has been successful in the past is for concerned neighbors to, not in a non-confrontational way, but approach the property owner and talk to them about your concerns and its impact, and the example it says for the school children walking by, and see if they would voluntarily move the flag, or maybe take it down at times of day when young people would see such language and or be impacted by it. Sometimes neighbors
disrespect.
Yeah, sometimes neighbors have more impact in these areas when the city is unable to address them, and I've seen it work before in Woodburn. There are examples where when people just reached out and said, hey, we respect your right to say or do whatever you want, but this is impacting other people. Could you work with us, as a neighbor?
All right, thank you.
I wonder if we could ask Bob to weigh in here and give us the legal reasons why we can't take actions against this individual.
Mr. Mayor and Council President and Council, Councilor Cornwell did a good job really of explaining the law. You've not only got the federal law, which is the First Amendment that protects free speech on a private sign, and certainly from what I've heard, I can understand the concern, and I'm sure that it is a real concern in the neighborhood. But you've got, as Councilor Cornwell pointed out, the free speech protection of the First Amendment, which is federal, but also in Oregon, you have even a stronger protection through the Oregon Supreme Court under interpretations of the Oregon Constitution. So basically it's protected speech, and it's, well, I don't know, probably 25 years ago, it'd be a question of what the city could do legally. And it's still that question, obviously. But secondly would be, what's your liability, even individually in federal court as city councilors and as a city council, if knowing that you were to try to regulate that anyway, you would have some liability. So, I mean, there's that, which 25 years ago you wouldn't have. So it's a correct statement of the law by the counselor, and I could try to answer any questions on it. I could get more specific if I need to, but there's both First Amendment and Oregon constitutional protections.
And Scott, I appreciate your suggestion, and I agree it might work in some situations, but I don't feel confident or safe to go approach a home that has such an objectionable thing on the window and suggest that maybe it shouldn't be there. So I will not be the one to go talk to them.
Well, maybe I can go with the nearest school principal and express our concerns about the language. It reminds me of when President Obama was asked about kids sagging with their jeans, right? And he said, I honor everyone's free expression of in free speech and attire, but like, brother, pull up your pants, right? So maybe we can get somebody to just say, brother, take down the F word. Right, so.
I appreciate it.
All right, Councilor Swanson.
I have nothing other than a shout out to the city's economic development team that did an amazing job and continues to do an amazing job redirecting their efforts to applying for grants and helping different businesses in the community. It's just, I have a very personal stake in the things that have been happening in that. I think all of these grants that are being awarded to our community are money well spent, and I'm just excited. So thank you to that team.
All right, Councilor Carney.
Oh, I don't have anything to add except to echo what Councilor Swanson has said. Makes a lot of sense. Great staff. Love you. Thank you.
All right, then I will echo that with, we had Scott and Jesse and Jamie present to our Chamber of Commerce a week and a half ago with the long laundry list of what we've heard about tonight and been hearing about. And of course, the Chamber of Commerce was very proud of the work that our city government does. And I just have I'll end on a personal experience. I was in City Hall and last week, and someone was at the door, and so ran back and make sure I was following protocols, and they he was looking to build a fence, right? So he explained it to me in Spanish. He did very limited English, and so walked back into the desk. Alyssa was there. Alyssa like explained, here's what it is. It became apparent he just wanted to do the whole thing right there. So we got his they handed him application. We filled it out right there. We had explained it to him. And then Dan was there, who also facilitated that. And then the next thing the fellow needed was he wanted to know exactly. And so Alyssa like took a picture off the computer, showed him his property line. It was kind of a funky property line. He shared with the neighbor, answered all his questions. And then Dan was there to describe what he needed to do. Right there, filled out the whole application, turned it in. And then he needed the thing where you find like metal, like the metal detector. And so here's what I learned about our city, right? Is that because he wanted to know exactly where his property line was. And so those 1 feet into the ground are like the 4 steel things that tell you right where they're at. So walked over to Public Works, knocked on the door like someone, the door was locked, but someone heard us. Brought him a metal detector. He checked it out, and then so in 20 minutes he got the services he needed here from our city so he could build his fence. So kudos to our city staff for being responsive. All right, with that, our next we have a week off kind of thing. It's 3 weeks until our next meeting on April 12th, and we'll communicate with you after our Tuesday meetings about the agenda coming up from that. And if it's appropriate for that time, we'll have our work session on Emergency Management 101. Any other questions or anything for the good of the order? All right, well, at nearly 10 o'clock, we'll call this entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Second.
Seconded.
All those in favor?
In favor.
All righty. Have a good next couple weeks, everybody. Take care.
This conference is no longer being recorded.
Okay. My poor son has to hear like all my stories because like that, and so do you.